When I got fired during the national championship game, my ex-boss texted me, "We're going younger." He tried to ruin my reputation, and then I. It was supposed to be one of those nights I'd remember forever, the kind that feels untouchable, iconic, like you're living in a highlight reel. I was sitting in the VIP suite at the national championship game in Atlanta, surrounded by leather seats, silver trays of steak sliders, and billionaire small talk. The crowd below was deafening, and every screen in the stadium pulsed with tension as the Georgia Bulldogs clawed their way back into the game. I'd busted my ass for years to get to this level of access, these connections, this room. It wasn't just about sports, it was about being where decisions were made. Deals happened in these suites, not boardrooms. This was where I belonged, at least, that's what I thought. Somewhere between the third touchdown and the marching band's thunderous return, my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it might be my assistant, or one of my clients texting me about the game, maybe someone looking for an introduction. I glanced down, already smiling, ready to show off whatever powerful name was on the screen. What I saw instead made my stomach drop through the floor. "You're done. Pack up by Monday. We're moving in a fresher direction." Nothing personal. I stared at it for too long, convinced my brain was misfiring, that my eyes were skipping some critical context. But there was no context, just that cold, clipped message from Camden. Camden Rhodes, the CEO of Pendrix Global. The man I had flown across continents for. The one I had once covered for when he forgot his talking points before a major investor call. That Camden had just fired me by text, during the game of the year, with 2 sentences that sounded like they'd been spit out by an AI trying to imitate empathy. I didn't even feel angry at first, just hollow. My hands went cold. I was surrounded by executives and partners, yet I suddenly felt like the loneliest person in the stadium. I blinked down at the message again, hoping the words had changed, twisted, anything other than what they were. But no, it was real. This was how it ended, not with a meeting, not with a warning, but a goddamn text. A decade of work, shredded like it was nothing. I sat perfectly still, willing my face not to betray the thousand things tearing through my mind. That's when I noticed the man next to me watching, not overly, but with the subtle attention of someone who missed nothing. He was older, maybe early 50s, with steel gray hair and a suit that probably cost more than my first car. His presence radiated composure, the kind that only comes with wielding real power. We'd crossed paths before at tech summits and global finance forums, but only briefly, the sort of nodding interactions between professionals who recognize each other's names but not yet their stories. It took me a second to place him, but when I did, my pulse kicked harder. Dorian Ashcroft, CEO of Kelmaris Tech, Camden's biggest competitor. A man who had built a company from one product in a rented lab into a multinational firm poised to crush Pendrix in market share. I felt a wave of heat rush through my chest, not embarrassment, not yet, but the kind of flustered awareness that came from knowing I had just been fired within reach of the one man who had every reason to relish my downfall. He didn't say anything right away, just sipped from his glass, eyes on the field, though I could tell he was watching me from the corner of his vision. I tucked my phone away, took a slow breath, and tried to act like my career hadn't just detonated at the 50-yard line. But I knew it showed. My throat was tight, my chest stiff. I wasn't heartbroken, not yet. I was just stunned. "Rough message?" Dorian asked, finally, his voice laced with that unbothered British drawl that somehow made everything sound like an invitation rather than a question. I looked at him, unsure whether to lie or lean into whatever this was. "Just work," I said. He gave a small nod, like he understood more than I'd said. I could tell that he knew. He didn't just guess from my expression. He knew something had gone down. There's a particular type of person you encounter in high-stakes industries, someone who thrives on reading between the lines and making connections others overlook. Dorian was clearly that kind. He wasn't trying to pry, but he wasn't ignoring it either. The silence that followed should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It was heavy, almost expectant. He let me sit with the discomfort, not out of cruelty, but because he understood the weight of the moment. He wasn't rushing it. I sat back, arms crossed, jaw tight. I felt humiliated, not because I'd been fired, but because I'd been discarded so carelessly, like a name on a spreadsheet they didn't even bother double-checking. A full 10 minutes passed before Dorian spoke again. He didn't look at me this time. "Just watch the game. If you're open to a new conversation," he said quietly. There might be something worth discussing. I turned, blinking at him, unsure I'd heard right. This wasn't small talk. His tone was too deliberate, too precise. It wasn't pity, it was interest. Business interest. My heart thudded, not with fear, but something sharper. Possibility. He didn't elaborate, didn't hand me a card or drop a pitch. Just sipped his drink and turned his focus back to the game. The offer was there, but it wasn't going to be forced. I said nothing at first, just nodded once, tucking the moment deep inside me. Because as much as I wanted to scream or cry or call Camden and tell him where he could shove his fresh direction, I knew better. I'd spent nearly 10 years building the bones of Pendrix's American division. I'd landed deals that Camden had taken credit for. I'd recruited clients who came only because they trusted me, not the company's bloated name. And now he wanted to erase all that with 2 sentences? Fine. But if he thought I was just going to vanish quietly into the background while he replaced me with some fast-talking junior exec with a glossy LinkedIn headshot, he had another thing coming. As the game reached a fever pitch, my attention splintered into 2 lanes. One half watched the field out of habit, pretending to still be engaged. The other half was already spiraling through possibilities. Dorian's words echoed louder than the roar of the crowd. If you're open to a new conversation. Maybe I was. Maybe I had to be. I wasn't ready to fade. I wasn't done building. And I damn sure wasn't going to let a man who fired me over text be the punctuation mark on the most intense chapter of my career. I didn't know where this night would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. Camden had no idea what he'd just started. I barely slept that night, which honestly wasn't surprising considering the whiplash of everything. One minute I was basking in that VIP suite, high off the energy of a national game and years of earned status, and the next I was quietly realizing my career had been tossed out like it was nothing. I'd stared at the hotel ceiling for hours, thinking through every version of how I'd respond, from the polite professional to the nuclear option that would torch Camden's entire image in the press. But nothing felt right. Not yet. My phone sat silently on the nightstand, still carrying that message like a digital stain I couldn't scrub off. I never deleted it. I just let it sit there, burning a hole in my memory. The next morning, while I drank stale hotel coffee and tried to convince myself to eat, I got the call. A blocked number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Reagan, came the familiar British voice on the other end. It's Dorian Ashcroft. Just hearing his name made me straighten up in my chair. I hadn't expected anything to come from our brief conversation at the game. Not yet anyway. But there he was, already following up, his tone calm but direct. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, he added, though we both knew damn well the timing was the whole point. I told him I was free, probably too quickly, and he said he'd like to meet, quietly, off the record, no PR buzz. Chicago, tomorrow night. It's not a pitch, he assured me, but it might be the start of something valuable. I booked my flight before we even hung up. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't owe explanations to people who hadn't checked on me since the firing. When I arrived in Chicago, I felt like I was standing between 2 identities, the one I'd spent years building at Pendrix, and whatever the hell came next. Dorian met me in a private dining room at an old hotel with stained glass windows and soundproofed walls. No handlers, no assistants, just him, already sipping tea and flipping through a manila folder. He stood when I entered, offered his hand with that same reserved but deliberate energy I'd seen at the stadium. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if I was doing him a favor, not potentially salvaging my career. We skipped the formalities. Within minutes, he laid it out. Kelmaris had been eyeing the American market for over a year, but internal leadership had been split on how aggressive the push should be. Now, with market gaps widening and Pendrix losing grip, he was ready to move quickly. "You know the players. You've built the contacts. You understand the tempo here," he said, watching me with the kind of gaze that didn't blink often. "And I need someone who doesn't just want a job, they want to build something." I didn't jump at the offer immediately. As tempting as it was, I knew better than to leap into another corporation with pretty words and vague promises. So I pushed back. I asked for specifics. I asked what autonomy meant. I asked what his board's tolerance for risk really looked like. To his credit, he didn't flinch. He welcomed every question like it was part of the interview, not me being vetted, but him earning my trust. By the time we finished our meal, he had laid out a draft plan that was more detailed than anything I'd seen from Camden in months. He offered me full operational control of the American expansion, team selection, client strategy, branding direction, even location choice. The salary was generous. The equity even more so. But it wasn't the money that caught me. It was the freedom. The real kind. No babysitting board members, no tiptoeing around insecure execs who only wanted to look smart in meetings. Dorian didn't want a figurehead. He wanted a general. Of course, he said, his tone light but firm, this only works if you want to outdo the man who tossed you aside. That landed harder than I expected. It was like he'd reached into the part of me that wasn't just wounded, but still on fire. I didn't answer right away. I told him I needed 2 days. He nodded, unbothered, and said to call when I was ready. But don't take too long, he added. The window's open now. Back in my hotel, I stared out the window at the Chicago skyline and felt something tighten in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was a shift. The realization that everything I thought had collapsed was really just the scaffolding being ripped away for something better. I didn't sleep much that night either, but for the first time in days, it wasn't dread keeping me up, it was anticipation. The next morning, I called Talia, still at Pendrick's, who answered in a whisper like she was hiding in a supply closet. I told her I was considering jumping ship entirely. She didn't sound surprised. I'd do it if I were you, she said. Camden's unraveling already. He brought in some 27-year-old from a lifestyle brand to shake things up, and nobody takes her seriously. She paused, then added, also, word is that losing you rattled a lot more clients than he expected. They didn't care about the brand. They cared about you. That gave me the final push. I sent the text to Dorian that afternoon. Just 6 words. I'm in. Let's build this. Within an hour, his assistant sent over paperwork. The transition was fast, deliberately so. We didn't want to give Pendrick's time to run interference. I didn't even return to the Pendrick's building to clear out my desk. I let Talia box everything up and ship it to a storage unit. Camden never reached out. Not a word. No apology, no attempt to explain the text, no pushback about me joining a rival. I don't know if it was arrogance or shame. Maybe both. But it was like I had been erased, as if my years of work could be wiped away with one silent week. Fine. Let him pretend I never existed. It would only make the blow hit harder when the fallout started. In the meantime, Dorian flew me to London for a final round of contract approvals and strategy sessions. His team was lean, sharp, and treated me like I was already part of their war council. There was no testing phase, no soft rollout. He introduced me as the new head of U.S. operations and made it clear to his people that my word would carry weight. When I returned stateside, I hit the ground running. We set up temporary headquarters in Denver, picked for its emerging tech scene and untapped client potential. I had 3 back-to-back meetings lined up within my first week, all former clients from Pendrick's, all curious to hear what I was doing next. I didn't push them. I didn't have to. I just told the truth. What we were building. Who was leading it? What we valued. By the end of the second week, 2 major accounts had already signed letters of intent to shift over. It felt surreal. I had expected resistance, some hesitation. But what I found instead was quiet relief. Like they'd been waiting for someone to break ranks and offer an alternative. One of them, a CTO named Erwin I'd worked with for 6 years, said, honestly, Reagan, we stayed with Pendrick's because of you. When I heard what happened, I figured they'd lost their minds. If you're starting something better, I'd rather be part of that. I could barely believe how fast it was happening. The momentum was building, and Pendrick's hadn't even realized they were already bleeding. I knew Camden. He wouldn't panic until a client actually walked. He always thought the machine was too big to fail. But the machine had never been the power, it was the operator. And he had just fired the one person holding the gears together. By the end of the month, I had a full operations plan in place, 2 project managers hired, and 3 legacy Pendrick's clients preparing to move contracts to Kelmaris. And Camden? Still silent. Still pretending nothing was happening. But soon, he was going to learn what it felt like to send someone a text that shattered a career, only to watch that person rebuild something stronger right next door. I didn't need confirmation that Camden had noticed what I was doing, but it came anyway. It started with a few former Pendrix colleagues texting cryptic little updates like, "Heads are spinning," or "Someone's finally nervous," followed by emojis they probably thought softened the message. But I didn't care about reactions from the sidelines. I cared about what came next. The first real sign of panic arrived as a whisper from one of the clients we were onboarding. He said Camden had called him personally, trying to clarify the misunderstanding about my departure and asking if he really wanted to be associated with someone who'd abandoned her team during a pivotal transition. That phrase nearly made me laugh. Camden, who couldn't be bothered to speak a single sentence to my face, was now painting me as the one who walked away. The projection was impressive, the desperation even more so. But what really floored me wasn't the spin, it was how fast he moved to sabotage. By the end of that week, 3 different clients told me they'd received unofficial warnings from Pendrix, implying I might be under legal scrutiny for breach of contract, even though I hadn't violated a damn thing. I checked with our attorneys at Kelmaris, and sure enough, Pendrix had submitted paperwork to the board alleging intentional disruption of client relationships and improper handling of confidential assets, neither of which held up to scrutiny. But the move wasn't about facts, it was about fear. Camden wanted to create enough noise to make clients pause, just long enough for him to convince them to stay put. But that was his first mistake. You can't bluff in a room full of people who've already seen your cards. Dorian had warned me that the moment would come, the retaliation wrapped in legalese, the attempts to bury me in red tape and backroom calls. But he also made it clear we wouldn't be waiting around to play defense. "We hit first, we hit clean," he said. So that's what we did. Our legal team responded immediately, not just with rejections of the claims, but with counter-evidence. Timestamps, client approvals, communications that proved Camden had misrepresented everything. And while they were building the response, I kept moving forward. I didn't want to just defend my reputation. I wanted to make it irrelevant. I wanted to be so far ahead that no one even remembered the noise. The more clients we secured, the more evident it became that Pendrix hadn't just underestimated me, they'd overestimated their own influence. Talia called me one night from her car, whispering into the speakerphone like she was afraid someone might hear her from the back seat. "You're not going to believe what I'm seeing in the weekly reports," she said. "The executive board is in a full panic. Camden's been holding closed-door meetings twice a day. Marketing's been told to spin harder, and they're slashing pricing on packages just to keep old clients from leaving." I asked if he had mentioned me by name. She said not directly, but everyone knew who he was trying to contain. "They even tried to spin your exit as a planned transition," she said. "Except no one told you." We both laughed, but it was bitter. There's something uniquely disgusting about watching someone you trusted weaponize your silence against you. Camden wasn't just trying to protect Pendrix's image, he was trying to erase mine. But the harder he pushed, the more obvious his cracks became. More clients started coming to me, quietly asking if there was room at Kelmaris. Some said they just wanted transparency. Others were furious they hadn't been told I was gone until their support calls started falling apart. One told me that Pendrix had replaced our quarterly strategy meeting with a generic PDF emailed from a marketing intern. "It's like they think we're too stupid to notice they don't care anymore," he said. I didn't have to say anything. I just listened. Because these conversations weren't about me convincing anyone. They were about giving people space to remember why they trusted me in the first place. That was something Camden would never understand. You can buy visibility, but not loyalty. And you sure as hell can't text your way into trust. Then came the second legal shot, this time nastier. Pendrix filed a complaint with one of the industry trade boards, alleging that Kelmaris had intentionally poached clients from a competing firm using illicit insider knowledge. The accusation wasn't just flimsy, it was laughable. I hadn't touched a single Pendrix database since my firing. All the movement had come from client-side interest. But again, the goal wasn't to win, it was to smear. I remember sitting at my desk reading the filing and feeling my stomach twist, not with fear, but rage. It wasn't enough for Camden to fire me by text. It wasn't enough to call me unstable to my clients. Now he wanted to ruin me professionally, smear me so thoroughly that no future partnership would touch me. That was the last straw for Dorian. He flew in that weekend, unannounced, and called an emergency strategy session. We sat in a glass-walled conference room, city lights blinking below, and went over the full plan. "They want war," he said. So we show them how badly they misjudged their opponent. The lawyers had found discrepancies in the paperwork Pendrix had submitted, backdated memos, internal claims that didn't align with email trails. In trying to hurt me, Camden had left a digital trail of recklessness. It's enough to build a corporate interference case, one of our attorneys said. Possibly even fraud, depending on how deep we go. I didn't hesitate. We go all the way, I said. He wanted a war. Let's give him the one he can't afford to lose. The next morning, we filed our own documentation. It was strategic, not spiteful. Precise, not reactive. We didn't call the press. We didn't leak anything to industry blogs. We just filed it clean, quietly, and with enough supporting evidence to make any board member reconsider who they were backing. Within 3 days, word started to spread that Camden was under internal review. Board members had started asking questions. Investors had requested emergency meetings. One of Pendrix's German partners pulled out of an expansion deal citing unresolved leadership concerns. And just like that, the machine started to choke. The man who had fired me in the middle of the championship game was now fighting for his job in the middle of a boardroom he used to control. I watched it all unfold with a strange, detached calm. Not because I didn't care, because I did, but because I had already moved on emotionally before I even packed my desk. My focus was on building Kelmaris into something stronger than Pendrix had ever been. I didn't want to beat them out of spite. I wanted to outpace them so thoroughly that they'd never catch up again. And slowly, client by client, that's exactly what we did. The numbers started to shift. Our quarterly revenue projections outpaced Pendrix for the first time. Former colleagues started emailing me resumes, quietly asking if there might be space on my new team. One even wrote, "It's strange, but you always seemed like the real CO anyway." I printed that one and pinned it to my wall, not out of arrogance, but as a reminder of what happens when you bet on yourself, of what it feels like to be discarded and come back stronger. Camden had thrown me into the fire, hoping I'd burn. Instead, I built something with the ashes. And I wasn't even done yet. Camden must have truly believed his title would shield him forever, like the weight of his name alone could outmatch logic, ethics, and a paper trail of lies. I don't know if he thought he'd worn me down or convinced the world I was unstable, but whatever fantasy he'd built around his own invincibility was about to collapse. The filing we submitted didn't just poke holes in his defense. It cracked the floor under his entire narrative. We didn't need to yell or run some dramatic PR campaign. We had documents, time-stamped communications, and client testimony ready to roll out in a calm, controlled sequence. Within days of our submission, we were getting quiet emails from Pendrix's internal legal team requesting clarification. I knew what that meant. They were trying to figure out just how much we knew and how badly Camden had exposed the company. I stayed focused on work because the momentum we'd built at Kelmaris was too important to pause. Clients were coming faster than we could onboard them. Some brought entire teams with them. One global media partner sent a senior strategist with an email that read, "Honestly, I trust you more than their leadership." Every success validated the risks we'd taken. Still, the deeper satisfaction came when I got a text from Talia late one Tuesday. Camden's been removed from direct communication with the board. Interim committee just formed. I stared at those words for a long second before I let them register fully. He wasn't fired, not yet, but his power was being carved away piece by piece. And the people doing it weren't enemies. They were his peers. The same people he used to belittle in meetings were now tightening the circle around him. By that weekend, the energy around the whole industry shifted. I walked into a partnership event in Dallas, and for the first time, people weren't just whispering in corners. They were openly asking me for insight. Not out of curiosity, but respect. They saw what we'd built and knew it wasn't just luck. Camden's downfall was dramatic, yes, but what mattered more was that we had risen quietly, efficiently, and without stepping over anyone to get there. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like reclaiming the space he tried to erase me from. One night, I got a call from a senior board member at a major venture firm that had backed Pendrix for years. He said, "You do realize what you've done, right? You didn't just recover. You repositioned the entire power dynamic. Camden tried to erase you, and you turned his silence into a signal." Those words hit me harder than I expected, not because I needed validation, but because they mirrored something I hadn't fully acknowledged. I hadn't just come back from a career hit. I had flipped the entire narrative and given people a blueprint for how to do the same. That was bigger than my pride. That was a legacy in motion. Dorian flew in that same week for an internal strategy summit, and over dinner, he laid out the expansion roadmap for the next 6 quarters. He said he wanted to invest heavily in our US base and bring in cross-market teams to build integrated tech solutions. I asked him what role he saw me in for that level of scaling, and he didn't hesitate. "You're not just running the division, Reagan. You're shaping the future of the company." That statement stayed with me, because even though I'd been confident, even though I had stood my ground through every threat and smear, I hadn't fully allowed myself to feel how far I'd come. Then came the final blow to Camden, and this time, it wasn't from me. One of his old allies at Pendrix, a COO who'd ridden his coattails for years, resigned suddenly. A quiet exit, no statement, but within hours the internal email leaked. Effective immediately, I can no longer stand behind decisions that compromise ethical leadership. It didn't name Camden, but it didn't have to. The implication was nuclear. After that, the collapse sped up. More team members jumped ship. International partners canceled pending renewals. One board member publicly posted a vague but loaded statement about renewing trust and direction in leadership. By the end of that month, Camden was officially removed. The message was short, clinical, and stripped of any legacy language. No thank you for his years of service. No tribute. Just a line about restructuring and realigning internal governance. That was it. After everything, after the firing text, the sabotage, the smears, and the legal threats, he was quietly swept aside like a headline from last quarter. Talia called me that night just to say, "It's done." And I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the chapter had officially closed. Not with fanfare, not with vengeance. Just a quiet shift in power, exactly the way it should have happened. I didn't need a win because I already had one. I had my team, my clients, my independence, and a company that valued everything Camden dismissed as replaceable. What mattered now is what came next. I wasn't going to waste this position by playing it safe. I wanted to build something that couldn't be undone by ego or incompetence. Something bigger than my own comeback. That weekend, we held a Kelmaris retreat in Colorado with all our new hires and a few key partners. Dorian gave a speech about vision and resilience, and halfway through, he nodded in my direction and said, "This company wouldn't be where it is without the decisions Reagan made." That moment didn't make me emotional, it made me resolved. Because the real work was just beginning. I spent the following months growing the team, building a mentorship program, and shaping our internal policies to protect against the very culture that tried to shove me out. I wanted every person who came through our doors to know that leadership wasn't about proximity to power, it was about building things people could count on. I made space for voices that usually got talked over. I pulled in diverse partners who'd been ignored by the old guard. And I never forgot the text Camden sent me during that championship game. I never deleted it. I just stopped needing it. It had done its job. It lit the fire. But now I didn't need the flame. I had built something brighter. And more importantly, I had finally become untouchable. I didn't expect to hear from him again, but of course, Camden had one more attempt buried under whatever pride he had left. The message came through a third party, a mutual connection from years back who now sat on some advisory panel I couldn't care less about. He said Camden wanted to talk, no strings, just closure, as if that word hadn't already been swallowed by everything you did to avoid accountability. I didn't respond. I wasn't angry anymore, and honestly, I wasn't interested. There was nothing left to say to someone who tried to erase my career while sipping whiskey in a glass office. He hadn't apologized, not really. He was just trying to reattach himself to something that had finally outgrown him. What he didn't realize, and probably never would, was that the silence he heard wasn't bitterness, it was freedom. I had nothing left to prove. Everything I'd done since that night in Atlanta had spoken louder than any text message he'd ever sent. My career didn't just recover, it transformed into something more sustainable, more impactful, and most of all, something I built by choosing the right people this time. The difference was staggering. At Pendrix, I had always been one unexpected board shift away from becoming disposable. At Kelmaris, I had equity, authority, and respect not as handouts, but as recognition for what I'd created from the ground up. And that wasn't luck. That was me betting on myself in the face of the ugliest kind of dismissal. We hit every goal Dorian and I had mapped out, then broke new ones without slowing down. We launched cross-market partnerships that brought global reach, expanded into education tech, and brought on brilliant women and men who'd never had a seat at the table until we made one. That's the part I'm proudest of, not just the revenue or press or high-profile features, but the ripple effect. I helped build a place that wouldn't throw someone away for turning 35 or refusing to shrink into a quieter version of themselves. The irony is, the legacy Camden tried to protect by firing me? It's already forgotten. Ask anyone under 30 in the industry who he is, and they'll probably shrug. But mention our Denver expansion, and they'll nod like you just brought up a blueprint. Sometimes, I still think about that night, the roar of the crowd, the glow of the field, and the pit I felt in my chest when I read his message. That moment could have defined me, could have broken me if I let it. But now it's just the prelude to everything that came after. Not a wound, just a mark, a before. And when people ask me how I stayed calm, how I pushed forward, how I didn't crumble under the weight of it all, I tell them the truth, because I knew what I was worth, even when the person who signed my paycheck forgot. I didn't get lucky. I got clear. I got brave. And I didn't stop moving. So no, I never wrote back. I never picked up the phone. Camden's chapter ended the moment he sent that message. Mine started the second I decided not to let it define me. And if anyone reading this is staring at their own version of that text, remember, it's not the end unless you let it be. Sometimes, the worst timing leads to the right beginning. Sometimes, getting fired is just you being freed by someone too short-sighted to see what you're about to do next.